Chapter 7, in which Oscar stands on a roof after attending a dinner party before seeing something lumpy in the water that's unrelated to either. Bremble returned with an old bag which surrendered an assortment of bandages and medicines. From them, Horace made a selection.
"It is a nasty strain, nevertheless," he said. "However, any pain is from acute tendinitis rather than fractured bone."
"That is good then?" the Derby asked, keen to ensure no handicap under the circumstances.
"If any injury is ever good, then it is so," he said, stepping back to permit Bremble's strapping of Paul with an expertise not lost despite the years past. "It needs merely good support for the joint and rest for the next 3 weeks.
"But I can walk on it?" Horace smiled.
"I very much doubt it. The discomfort will be considerable."
"But if I need to?"
"My dear cat, I would suggest you refrain from putting any weight on it for at least 3 weeks. That is my advice, but you do as you must."
Bremble finished securing the bandage. It was beautifully done, and the Derby said it felt much better and rather like comfortable concrete. "I quite enjoyed that," Bremble said, getting up and dusting herself down. "It was rather like old times, don't you think, Hoary?" The dog smiled reflectively and nodded.
"How on earth did you manage such a sprain?"
he asked, settling himself into a comfortable chair and gesturing for Oscar to do the same. "I drove off a cliff," the Derby said. Intrigued with bookshelves, Oscar perused its titles instead, saying, "It's actually not as strange as it sounds, Horace, because I was chasing her at the time." With a frown, Horace nodded, to compliment the acceptance his guests seemed content with.
"And is that something you do on a regular basis, the Derby?"
"No, not at all. It was the first time, actually."
"I see."
He turned to Oscar then.
"And were you chasing her for any particular reason, young cat?"
"Indeed, I was, yes, for this is the animal you suggested I seek last night." Horace's eyes widened, and his monocle fell. "And this," Oscar advised the Derby, "is Dr. Horace Humpelhenke, a member of the ruling council of Ruen." While each stared at the other, Oscar returned to the bookshelves. Frankly, if either lunged in spite, they could do so by themselves, because he'd had enough of lunging for one day. Any pouncing or swiping could sort itself out while he looked at books. But there was no growl of vengeance or hiss of reprisal. There was no furniture thrown or lamps smashed, nor any crashing bookshelves or hurled paperweight. There was no hitting of bandaged limb, or poking of remaining eye, nor any vulgar adjective countered by some obscene label of noun. Their silence was more disconcerting. Worried, Oscar turned back to them. But the Derby and Horace remained as they'd been, staring at each other. "Thank you for bandaging my paw," the Derby said.
"You are most welcome, my dear,"
Horace replied. Relieved to discover a counsellor had been spared her wrath, the Derby ate her dinner with the sort of fervour that left Oscar concerned it would reappear faster than conventional courtesy dictates. Bremble, however, held no such misgivings, and heaped food upon the Derby's plate as quickly as the cat shovelled it into her face. And because Horace remained convinced the Derby had been coerced into the previous night's horror, dinner was a delightful affair and left Oscar convinced he was with friends he'd known for years, which was odd, considering he hadn't any. Glancing at a clock, Horace pushed his chair from the table and stood.
"It is nearly time, young cats, for me to show you something curious."
Gesturing that they follow, he led them into the hallway, where he gave each a coat. Climbing the stairs, he then stopped, remembering the Derby's paw. But she had no such hesitation, and took the first few with little complaint, and successive ones with even less. Horace led them upstairs until stopping at a little door. When he opened it, they entered an attic. The room was clearly Horace's alone, as there was no evidence of Bremble's tidiness. Indeed, the cat stared at a cluttered mess of books and astronomy apparatus. Old telescopes leant against walls, Sextants lay upon dusty shelving, and a desk strained beneath an archaeology of papers. Charts, drawings and maps spread in a clutter, and mobiles of stars and constellations hung from the low roof, bobbing in air smelling of musty wood and well-polished brass. So intrigued was Oscar that he didn't notice Horace and the Derby disappear through a second door until cold sea air stabbed through the mustiness. Pulling the coat on over his beautiful coat, he followed. Upon an expanse of flat roof, they were as high as any might hope to reach upon the headland. To the north, the coastline melted into black, while to the south, Ruen sparkled beside its deep bight of harbour. Night stretched in a blanket across a thick oil of sea, and devoid of moon, starlight upon its corrugations left the world both vast and compressed. Oscar took a deep breath of salts and sea, realizing that by the light of day this place would be a most beautiful vantage to watch earth turn against sky. Pulling his coat tighter, he turned to Horace, who'd retrieved one of the telescopes and was setting it up on the roof. He looked up at the sky, wondering what could be of relevance to their predicament up there. Horace adjusted the tripod and tightened its screw.
"It is quite true, young cat. There is little of relevance in the heavens to our circumstance beneath. And it's fair to say that for all the years I have been upon this earth, I have yet to find any answers up there anyway."
He paused then, and looked up as well.
"Although, in all honesty, I feel answers would only detract from its majesty.
He winked at the cats.
Perhaps I much prefer the need to question than to know."
Oscar smiled. "Have you always been interested in astronomy?" Horace let the Derby support the telescope, while he adjusted its legs.
"I must confess that my interests were initially far from noble, as my first telescope was used for observing practical jokes from afar when I was a puppy."
"That doesn't sound like you at all," the Derby said, giving the weight of telescope back to the dog. He set it securely upon the roof.
"I think the Derby with age comes reflection. I soon tired of a rapscallion nature, and turned my eyes upon the heavens rather than victims."
Oscar watched the animals. It seemed ludicrous their being enemies, for here they were, side by side, playing with telescopes beneath stars, and he wondered whether any of it was true. The Pajami's vicious cruelty, the Derby's fermented manure spreading, and Horace's certainty something dreadful was imminent. The telescope ready, Horace ushered them back into the cosy attic, where Bremble had left a nice jug of steaming hot fin. "What happens now?"
"We wait,"
said Horace, pouring the hot fin.
"We wait until there is something curious to see."
"Which is?" Oscar asked. Horace smiled and offered him a mug.
"That is what I want you to help me answer, young cat."
They waited in silence for a time. "I need to say," the Derby began, "I had no intention of causing such distress as last night, and I can only apologise for such recklessness." Horace glared at her until she dared acknowledge his stare. When she did, the dog's growl was benevolent, despite the small confines of room.
"I think the Derby you have little to apologise for. Indeed, it is I who should do so, because of the increased repression of the ruling council."
She blinked at him, having not expected anything of the sort.
"For I do not believe you were responsible for such mayhem,"
Horace continued.
"Your protests have always been inconvenient and embarrassing to the council, albeit with very bad spelling, and far from anything as vicious as last night. Moreover, I believe you have every reason to protest against the manner in which you and animals of your generation have been treated."
The Derby stared at him, open-mouthed, and then at Oscar, who pointed at his so she might close hers. Not expecting such leniency, she was lost for words. "Or perhaps that can be an end of the matter," Oscar said, hoping this might be an official reconciliation and he could return to Asquith without losing any more appendages.
"No,"
Horace said.
"not at all. for I believe what occurred last night was forced by the council to legitimize some sort of severe retribution."
"What do you mean?" asked the Derby, heavy with relief. "It must involve an animal in your ranks," Oscar said to her. "You remember you admitted as much in my hotel room." He put down his steaming mug. "Who was it, the Derby?" "No," she whispered. "Not him." She shook her head, convinced. "Who, the Derby? Who insisted on such horror?" "He insisted only because we hadn't much time to prepare, not because he is in any way deceitful. Just like myself, he was caught up in the urgency of opportunity." "Yes, but who?" She sank back then and said, as though the name tore at the soft flesh of her throat, "Sedovitz Tapanu." The name meant nothing to Oscar, and he looked at Horace, who shrugged. "Were you not suspicious of his age?" Oscar asked. "He is no older than you or I."
"If that is the case," said Horace, "if he is a young animal, then he isn't part of the ruling council, I can assure you of that. The Purging wouldn't tolerate any animal much younger than she."
Oscar frowned. Although it made sense the Second Autumn might be an inflammatory sabotage of sorts, why it involved an animal not part of the ruling council only raised further questions.
"What does this animal look like?"
Horace asked. The Derby thought for a moment. "He is a cat, large and black," she said, "with a white tummy and thox." Her voice became dreamy then, and for the rest of her description she didn't lisp once. "He has wonderful fur, and a black patch over one eye that makes him look like a pirate. He's acutely intelligent, very debonair, and a rather brilliant schematician. He's brave, too, and, well, altogether rather magnificent, really." Oscar glanced at Horace, doubtful of her impartiality if Sedovitz had this effect on her. While the Derby continued to swoon, Oscar asked him, "If this Sedovitz character is not part of the ruling council, it seems absurd to think he might be manipulating them for his own agenda." Horace thought for a moment.
"I agree. I think it's extremely unlikely. The Purging is obsessively controlling, and I suspect there is nothing she isn't aware of regarding Ruen."
He growled then.
"She is indeed ulterior."
"So why would either she or this Sedovitz character wish to maim the council?" But Horace could only shrug. Oscar asked, "If the Purging is aware of all that occurs in Ruen, why has the Derby been allowed to continue her acts of embarrassment?"
"I would have thought that was obvious. Her activities give credence to the council's calls for cumulative retribution."
"So we must assume Sedovitz is somehow involved with the ruling council?"
"It is a fair assumption, perhaps, though I do not believe he is. I suspect instead that your prior assumption is correct. This Sedovitz animal is not working for the ruling council, but instead for a very private agenda."
"Whose?"
"Well, the Purging's, of course."
"What, you mean without the rest of the council's knowledge, indeed without your knowledge?"
"Frankly, this Sedovitz animal rings no bells with me. And you must remember, the ruling council, and indeed the majority of original residents of Ruen, are not interested in details of governance, provided Ruen's tradition is maintained. They have lived their life of responsibility and are tired and wealthy and content to turn a blind eye to those who maintain tradition."
"Is it really as simple as that?" Oscar asked. "Is that what this all comes down to? Maintaining a tradition? Keeping Ruen only for those old, wealthy and retired?" Reluctantly, Horace nodded. "What about the blackmail?" whispered the Derby. Oscar nodded. "And the chief of police, is he on the council's payroll?"
"All civil services are on the council's payroll."
"No, I mean, was he appointed because he's so utterly incompetent?" And he looked at the Derby in apology. Horace frowned.
"I'm certain any chief of police would be appointed on merit."
"But he's so hopeless."
"My dear Oscar, Ruen has an almost non-existent crime rate. How can that be anything other than a reflection of competence?"
Oscar frowned too. If the Derby's father was being blackmailed without the council's knowledge, it suggested the Purging had a personal agenda after all. "I don't like the Purging at all," he growled. Securing his monocle, Horace hurried to the door and peered into the night. When he bounded from the attic, the cats glanced at each other before scrambling to follow. Horace fiddled with the telescope and peered down to the sea. With coats pulled tight, they waited. After squinting through the eyepiece for a time, he cried in triumph before offering the view to Oscar. Peering through the lens, Oscar saw nothing at first and said as much. Horace told him to wait for a moment and not move the telescope. And then, across dark of sea, something appeared. A large black craft eased into view, heaving across darkness with disconcerting stealth. "It's a vessel of some sort," Oscar realised, looking up and peering across the sea. He stood aside for the derby. A craft that size with no navigation lights is certainly curious, and also terribly dangerous, I would have thought. He turned to Horace. "Where's it from?" The dog shrugged. "Where's it going?" Another shrug. He turned back to the sea. Peering through the telescope, the derby said, "I can't see anything." Oscar took the instrument and found it for her again. After a moment, she swiveled the thing in frustration. "I still can't see anything." Again he found it, with Horace suggesting he aim where the craft had not yet passed, so it might appear for her as it had for him. "It's a barge of some sort," she then advised triumphantly. "And a rather large one, I would say." Horace then offered all he knew.
"I have seen it every new moon for the past 6 months. It passes out to sea there, and then 3 hours later it returns."
"Smugglers?" the derby asked, looking up, and leaving Oscar grateful to be downwind from a word beginning and ending in S, and wondering whether she'd just spat on herself as a consequence. Horace shrugged.
"I very much doubt it. As I told you, the ruling council knows everything going on around this coast."
"You mean the pajami," Oscar said, and Horace looked at him, reluctantly.